Trevor, and today I'll be responding to Joseph Bartolo's speech about his main claim was maintaining a gluten-free diet is undesirable for the general population. And his secondary claims were, one, it's undesirable because it would require a lot of effort. Two, it's undesirable because it can cause negative health effects. And three, because it only benefits people with celiac disease. Those are very problematic arguments. First, the small minor, but a lot of effort is very subjective. Also, more importantly, that effort that it requires can be somewhat easily reduced with the use of various tools, such as, for instance, Microsoft Excel, notes about what sort of stuff you need to, what sort of stuff is always safe, what sort of stuff is generally safe, but you need to check the labels, where to check those labels, etc. Those kinds of things can significantly reduce the amount of time that it would take. Also, there's quite a few foods out there that are gluten-free and are pretty readily available, although some of them aren't perfect, as in you'll have to check the labels to see whether there could be cross-contamination. For instance, amaranth, brown rice, wild rice, white rice, buckwheat, almond meal flour, coconut flour, corn, cornstarch, glum, melamine, pea flour, potatoes, quinoa, sorghum, soy flour, and teff. Those are a few examples. There's a good number more. In general, it's not too bad once you get going with it, once you get the tools, and once you start learning the resources to maintain a gluten-free diet. Next, any negative health effects that would arise from an unbalanced gluten-free diet as opposed to a gluten-free diet in general. So if you, say, use vitamin supplements, which, again, you might have to check the labels for cross-contamination, or to check if the supplements themselves are gluten, those can make up any holes, basically, in a gluten-free diet. It's not that bad that you have to take a few vitamin tablets along with a meal every once in a while. Next, perhaps more importantly, for the third argument, that it only benefits people with celiac disease, there's also another thing called non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And it's much more prevalent than celiac disease is. Celiac disease affects 1 in about 155 people in the United States. Non-celiac gluten sensitivity affects about 3 in 50, which is much, much more prevalent. It's not that well documented, but that's what our documentation thus far shows us. It's fairly prevalent, and it does feature a number of the symptoms in lesser amounts that celiac disease has. So that's the argument that maintaining a gluten-free diet is undesirable just because not everybody has celiac disease, isn't valid because there's also non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Moreover, and finally, not all people with celiac disease or this non-celiac gluten sensitivity know that they have it, specifically because a lot of the symptoms of it can be passed off as other things. So let's look at some numbers. So about 133 people in the United States have celiac disease. And it takes roughly 4 years for somebody showing noticeable symptoms of celiac disease, specifically, not the gluten sensitivity, it's non-celiac, but of celiac disease to be diagnosed with it. That's a decent while to be diagnosed with something. So 21% of patients who tested positive according to the study from the University of Chicago Medicine or would have been denied access to the tests to celiac disease by either the doctors who figure it's invasive, or they didn't have the time to do it or whatnot. Their physicians refuse to do a test, or their insurers refuse to pay for it because, and if one suspects that one has celiac disease, would it not then be wise, given how many potential people that is, to risk it anyway? After all, once you get over the hurdles of learning some of the basics of taking notes and sticking to them, would it not then be wise to perhaps go gluten-free anyway, on the off chance that you are gluten sensitive or have celiac disease and you have been diagnosed with it? Thank you.
All right, structurally everything is pretty good. On the first point, you say, the notion of it being difficult is a subjective claim, which I think is a reasonable argument to make, and then you attempt to diminish the true effort that would have to be made there by suggesting multiple ways in which it could be taken care of without being too onerous. Those are all hypotheticals at best. There's not really any data on this. It's an interesting hypothetical example. I'm not exactly sure what the advocate's information on this particular point was, because you never really make reference to the specific data that the advocate used. You did, on the next piece of information, suggest a long list of products that are available that are gluten-free, which I thought was a good idea. It would be good also to provide a source for that long list of products so that we know where it came from. On the second point, you basically say, if the problem, I think the summary of the argument is that the problem that the advocate's talking about is that there would be holes in people's nutritional makeup if they gave up gluten entirely, and your argument is they could supplement those pretty easily with vitamins. And that sounds fine. I don't remember, but again, there's not really any discussion of the advocate's evidence on this particular point, how they reasoned, how dramatic those inferences are. I don't even remember how significant that imbalance was. It may not have been all that significant in the first place. So your answer is not a bad answer, but it certainly feels less complete than it could be. On the third point, I thought this is where your argument was best, where you in essence argued that there is likelihood that a lot more people need to be cautious about consuming gluten than we suspect. The advocate thinks only celiacs, but in fact there are all these non-celiac sensitive people who are likely to have problems, and that's much more broad, and so they have to be careful about those sorts of things. I thought that was a reasonable argument to make. The time period that it takes again, both that and the time period it takes to get a diagnosis, those are good arguments, but there's no source citation for that information. Finally, we get a piece of source citation for the last argument, which is a lot of it goes undiagnosed because doctors and insurers don't want to go through this process, and we had a statistic that went along with that. And I thought, well, why did you cite the source on that and not on all of the other things that you had? That seemed a little bit problematic. All right, thank you.